Hi, welcome to a beginner's guide to horror for the Easily Spooked. So, you're here because you want to watch a horror movie. The problem is, you're an easily spooked person. You're someone that gets scared about horror movies and wants to better prepare themselves this time around. Well, first, I want to say kudos. It's scary for an easily spooked person to commit to a horror movie watching night. But you're hyping yourself up for it, and you deserve to be scared if that's what you want to happen. And that brings us to the next part, because horror is not one flavor. The horror genre is made up of many flavors and subflavors with appeal depending on individual taste. For example, psychological horror, body horror, zombies, demons, supernatural entities, what have you. There's really all kinds of various genres within horror itself, and there's ways to direct yourself towards those films that are going to better suit your taste. Because frankly, you deserve a horror meal that is suited to your tastes. Naturally, that leads to the next question. What exactly are your tastes when it comes to horror? And you might come back with the very reasonable answer of, I don't know, I haven't really watched enough horror to figure that out. So then how do you, as an easily spooked person, figure that out without already having watched a bunch of horror movies? Where's the balance? Do you just jump in? Do you go off a random recommendation and hope for the best? Well, there are plenty of ways to research horror movies and start figuring out what sits best with you. But to give you somewhere to begin, I've developed a loose category system for what I'm calling safer types of horror. And I want to be very, very clear about what I mean by safer. These categories don't pretend that the fear, violence, or scary thing isn't there. Instead, they're meant to show you some of the ways horror movies can put boundaries around frightening material. A movie might stylize something until it feels less realistic, exaggerate a threat until it becomes fantastical, limit how much suffering you're actually shown, or give all that tension somewhere to go through comedy, adventure, or spectacle. These choices can soften parts of the experience. They do not make a movie universally safe. What scares one person might barely affect another, and what feels manageable to somebody else could be genuinely distressing to you. So if there are particular subjects, images, or kinds of violence that you know could cause you serious distress, it's worth researching the individual movie before you watch it, rather than relying on one of these categories alone. What I'm really trying to tell you is that you have more control over your horror experience than it might initially feel like you do. You don't have to blindly pick something and hope you survive the next 2 hours. You can start noticing what kinds of fear a movie uses, how intently it uses them, and what boundaries it puts around them. I'm just giving you a few trail markers on your journey as you start to explore horror. Where you go from there is up to you. Next is a category I'm calling theatrical horror. Again, these are faux categories I've created specifically for this video. You'll hear the word theatrical used in discussions of film, but I'm using it here in my own, slightly different way. Theatrical horror uses stylized, exaggerated, or visibly constructed scares to create some distance from reality. In a moment, I'll show you examples from both family-oriented and adult-oriented horror, and there are plenty to choose from, especially because family films, comedies, and adventure movies frequently borrow horror themes, images, and iconography. Essentially, theatrical horror reminds us that we're watching a performance. We can see the work of makeup artists, practical effects teams, set designers, costume designers, and performers creating something deliberately heightened. The ghost might be too ghostly, the mansion might be too gothic, the monster might look bizarre, exaggerated, or only semi-realistic. And in family-oriented theatrical horror especially, these techniques are often paired with comedy, adventure, reassuring characters, or softer presentations of violence and danger. The scary thing is still there, but the way it is presented gives us some distance from the discomfort of real-world danger. It can still scare us. It just doesn't always ask us to experience that fear as something completely realistic. And here we have a few direct examples of family-leaning theatrical horror: Beetlejuice, The Haunted Mansion, Hocus Pocus, and The Addams Family. I consider this a potentially safer category because family-oriented movies often create boundaries around their darker implications. If children and families are a significant part of the intended audience, then the movie is generally more likely to soften how directly it presents violence, suffering, or frightening material. That doesn't mean the darker material isn't there. Beetlejuice is an interesting example. Death, body horror, and supernatural danger are everywhere, but they're filtered through exaggerated makeup, stop-motion effects, comedy, and surreal imagery. Fans of the movie love that exaggerated, slightly disturbing aesthetic. It's macabre, but it's also visibly constructed. Hocus Pocus is another great example. It's become a Halloween classic and an annual viewing ritual for a lot of people, but its story is actually pretty dark. Child death and supernatural danger give the witches genuine menace. The difference is that the movie limits our exposure to suffering. We aren't shown prolonged or realistic scenes of children being murdered. Instead, the movie repeatedly directs our attention towards Halloween spectacle, comedy, friendship, magic, and adventure. The darker implications remain, but the way they're presented gives us some distance from them. Now we've looked at more family-friendly, easily spooked person-friendly films, but what happens when we keep the theatricality and start moving toward more adult horror? Adult theatrical horror asks you to take the darkness seriously without necessarily asking you to experience it as reality. There's a funny parallel here. As these movies become more adult, grim, and willing to engage with darker truths, in some ways they also allow us to become the scared child again. Sometimes a curious part of my brain wonders whether that's part of horror's appeal. Maybe there's something strangely comforting about being frightened under the covers again, when the scary thing could still feel separate from ordinary life, and the adults around us seem capable of keeping the darker truths of the world somewhere outside the room. Regardless, adult theatrical horror is less protected than the family-oriented films we just discussed. The danger is greater, the consequences are heavier, but stylization can still create distance. Adult theatrical horror places its danger inside a heightened Gothic world, elaborate costumes, dramatic lighting, decaying mansions, fog, supernatural imagery, and exaggerated characters make the horror feel deliberately constructed rather than everyday. The movie isn't necessarily joking about any of this. In fact, it may take its ghosts, murders, grief, and violence completely seriously, but everything is dressed for the occasion. The danger is greater, but the theatricality still gives it boundaries. And this is a good place to pause. You are allowed to stop at family theatrical horror. Maybe you love spooky sets, witches, ghosts, and Halloween atmosphere, but you're simply not interested in the darker themes or heavier consequences that come with the adult horror. That's completely fine. We're trying to navigate horror with greater confidence. We are not trying to conquer increasingly frightening movies just because they exist. You don't owe the genre proof that you can handle it. Instead, you can start asking yourself what you actually want from the experience. Do I want spooky play and reassurance? Or do I want spooky style being used to think about heavier things? Maybe adult theatrical horror is a little too much for you sometimes. Maybe all those gothic dressings are beautiful, but they're also intense. Maybe the costume the movie puts on is just a lot. Crimson Peak, for example, is gothic horror to the absolute max, and it loves showing it off. So maybe you want something a little more emotionally grounded. You're willing to deal with darker themes, uncomfortable truths, or genuine danger. You just don't particularly want to be terrified out of your knickers while doing it. Well, low blood or no gore horror exists. And this category is pretty straightforward. It can appear across all kinds of horror subgenres, but the basic idea is that the movie deliberately limits how much graphic bodily harm we actually see. There are plenty of reasons a filmmaker might make that choice. Sometimes limiting gore helps a movie reach a broader audience or stay within a PG-13 rating. Sometimes it helps maintain a particular tone: eerie, disturbing, melancholy, suspenseful, without becoming visceral or splattery. Other times, the filmmakers may want our attention somewhere else. Maybe the horror is really about grief, paranoia, relationships, social commentary, or some uncomfortable truth underneath everything that's happening. And sometimes I suspect they simply don't want us getting too lost in the blood and the sauce of the matter. Because gore commands attention. Once a movie starts showing us exactly what violence is doing to a human body, that can become a major part of the experience. Limiting that exposure gives the movie more room to focus on the suspense, the emotional consequences, the characters, or the ideas surrounding the violence. And importantly, low gore does not necessarily mean low violence. Characters can still die. Terrible things can still happen. The movie is simply putting a boundary around how closely we are asked to witness the physical suffering. Something terrible can happen without the movie requiring us to see exactly what terrible things happening to a human body look like. And if one way to soften horror is to show us less, another is to give all that fear and tension somewhere to go. Which brings us to campy and fun horror. This part is a little shorter because the mechanism here is pretty straightforward. These movies can reduce fear by releasing tension through comedy, absurdity, or self-awareness. Maybe the characters are trapped in situations that are so ridiculous they become difficult to take completely seriously. Maybe the movie exaggerates familiar horror cliches, or maybe it looks directly at the genre itself and gives us a little wink. These movies can feel safer because at least some of the time they're trying to make you laugh right alongside the screaming. And there's almost a funny little spectrum here. Some fun horror is incredibly accessible, silly, energetic, maybe even a little lighthearted. You don't necessarily have to know anything about horror to enjoy the joke. But as these movies become more self-aware, they can also start feeling like inside jokes for people who already know the genre. The Cabin in the Woods is a great example. A lot of its humor comes from recognizing familiar horror conventions and watching the movie deliberately play with them. So I think one useful question is this movie simply having fun in the spirit of horror? Or is this movie winking at me because it knows I recognize the horror cliche? Either way, comedy can act as a release valve. Horror builds tension. Fun horror gives that tension somewhere to go. And my last safer horror category of the night is monster horror. Again, not because monster movies are free from violence, death, or genuinely upsetting material. They absolutely are not. But the scale and plausibility of the threat can create another kind of distance. Being hunted by another human being is frightening partly because we understand that it could happen. Being hunted by a gigantic subterranean worm, an alien predator, or a creature large enough to destroy a city is operating on a much grander, more fantastical scale. And while some of us may be disappointed to hear it, aliens are probably not coming down tomorrow to destroy civilization. If they haven't gotten around to it yet, I think we've got pretty decent odds. That exaggeration can keep us from getting quite as emotionally close to the danger. We recognize the fear underneath it, being hunted, eaten, trapped, overwhelmed, without necessarily recognizing the scenario itself as something that could happen to us. But again, it all depends on how the filmmakers compose the experience. Are we watching an enormous monster destroy a city from a distance? Or are we standing right next to it, listening to it breathe? Are the characters primarily dealing with an impossible creature, or is the monster simply one part of a story that's also asking us to confront grief, cruelty, loss, helplessness, or the uglier parts of humanity? A monster movie has room for all of those things. The creature might be wildly unrealistic, while the emotions surrounding it become painfully intimate. And that brings us back to something I keep returning to throughout this guide. How close does the filmmaker want you to be to the horror? Maybe the monster stays distant for most of the movie, and you only feel deeply connected to the characters when they're celebrating their victory, or mourning the people they lost at the end. Or maybe the movie deliberately collapses that distance and puts you right beside the thing you were previously able to admire as spectacle. It's all in the composition. Different filmmakers serve different horror meals. And that brings us to the end of this guide. I want to wrap things up with a few broader recommendations for making horror a little more manageable when you're an easily spooked person. Because horror movies are scary. They are supposed to be scary. The goal here was never to guarantee that you'll never have an unpleasant experience, never get frightened, or never accidentally end up more scared than you wanted to be. Instead, the goal is to show you that you can approach fear in a way that feels more comfortable to you. You don't have to accept someone's random horror recommendation with complete hesitation-free, blind trust, unless, of course, you enjoy going into movies that way. You're allowed to research what you're about to watch. You can read the Wikipedia plot summary, check IMDb, look through Reddit discussions, search for content warnings. There are entire new resources now dedicated to helping viewers figure out what potentially upsetting material appears in a movie before they commit to watching it. One example is, does the dog die? It began with a wonderfully straightforward question, does the dog die? But has grown into a much broader collection of content warnings covering all kinds of potentially distressing material. And if you already know that things like severe violence, blood and gore, jump scares, animal harm, extremely heightened tension, or particular themes tend to bother you, you can find out about them ahead of time. That doesn't automatically mean you shouldn't watch the movie. Maybe you look something up, discover that it contains exactly the thing that frightens you, and decide, you know what, I still want to try it. That's okay too. The important part is that you're now making an informed choice. You know a little bit more about the horror meal being served, and you get to decide whether you'd actually like to sit down and eat it. You might still get scared. You might even occasionally discover that something was too much for you, but you don't have to wander into horror completely blind. You can choose what you watch. You can learn what kinds of fear work for you. You can decide where your boundaries are. And hopefully, this guide has given you a few trail markers for figuring that out.